Okay. Okay, so yeah, GMO greetings. I'm Ojirafo Kwesi Radnehmbata Akan, Ojirafo of Akwamuman, Amarukai Tipi Mu, the Akwamu Nation in North America within Ojiraman, the purified nation, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people, African Black people in the Western Hemisphere. So we want to go into this subject in 4 different parts, 4-week online course. This is the first time we're teaching this as a course. Of course, there's a lot of misinformation regarding this topic. Of course, it's been, reignited with Kanye and Kyrie and so forth, and, them sharing the movie Hebrews to Negroes, which is pure foolishness, total fraudulent, foolish information, and, totally non-factual information. So it's been brought up into the, mindset of a number of our people in this country and around the world. So in our publication, KUKUU-TUNTUM, the Ancestral Jurisdiction, we address this. And let's pull that publication up real quick. We published the KUKUU-TUNTUM, the Ancestral Jurisdiction. Actually, this is the 20th anniversary of our publication. We released it as an audiobook first, and then we published the printed version. And in the book, we go into detail showing the cosmology of creation, the nature of ancestral religion, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African ancestral religion. As you can see on the front cover, we mentioned specific topics that we deal with, dealing with cosmology, origin of creation, origin of the name Afuraitkaitnut, Africa, origin and nature of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people, the origin of the whites and their offspring, rooted in their perverse practice of dissexuality, homosexuality, and so forth, the cosmological structure of creation, the nature of the deities and ancestral spirits, ancestral religion, and so forth. But we also show the cosmology and how these fictional characters of the fictional false religions were manufactured. Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Moses, Aaron, David, Judah, Jesus, Mary, Yeshua ben Pandera, Muhammad, Allah, Yahweh, Buddha, Brahman, Elohim, Solomon, Sheba, Menelik, all of that. We go into detail about all of that, showing the cosmological foundation from our culture and how fragments of our cosmology were taken from by the whites and their offspring to manufacture these fictional cartoon characters. None of these biblical, Quranic, or Talmudic characters existed in any form or of any race whatsoever. Now, of course, this book is a free download, as are all of our 31 books. Just want to scroll down to a specific section. Okay. And in this portion of the book is where we touch on things that we will get into detail about today. So hold on a second. All right. So, of course, we chose the title of the class, Aperu, Hebrews Never Existed, Cosmology of the Crossover in Kamit. So we show first and foremost that the entire Hebrew myth is a myth. Moses never existed. Moshe never existed. The children of Israel never existed. There was no group of individuals, Black, white, or otherwise, that was a group of individuals called Hebrews who, were liberated from ancient Kamit and went up into Canaan and so forth and established a nation that is pure fraud. Never happened at all. For us, Black people, to foolishly attempt to trace our descent, our lines of descent, to fictional characters in a fictional group is just as stupid as trying to trace your line of descent to the elves that were Santa's helpers at the North Pole. If you want to call yourself North Pole Elvelites, and you can trace your blood lineage back to these, helpers of Santa, and the white man doesn't want you to know your true identity as a North Pole Elvelite, because if you know that, then you know who you really are. Pure stupidity. And if you saw somebody trying to trace their blood circle or blood lineage back to a fictional group of elves at the North Pole, you would see that these individuals, on one hand, are misinformed, but when they're given the proper information, they continue. Then you know they have some mental and emotional instability. The same has happened with our people. These little groups that popped up in the late so-called 1800s, early so-called 1900s in United States of America, little Moorish groups, Hebrew groups, Moorish Hebrew groups, Islamic groups, and so forth. Our people were coming out of enslavement. We were still enslaved mentally, many of our people, and those of us who attached ourselves to white culture and pseudo-religion. The whites and their offspring sought to force fake religion on us so that we wouldn't embrace our own ancestral traditions, our own culture, our own religious practice, our own ritual practice, because they understood that the revolts that led to the end of enslavement were fomented by those of us who practice Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African ancestral religion. That includes the Hoodoo tradition, which is our Akan ancestral religion in North America, the Juju tradition, which is Yoruba ancestral religion in North America, the Voodoo tradition, which is Ewe and Fon ancestral religion in North America, the Wanga tradition, which is the Ovambo tradition in North America, and so forth. We were guided and empowered by our ancestresses and ancestors and the deities. As we practice our ancestral religion, we learned how to wage war against the whites and their offspring, not just militarily, which we did, but also chemically and biologically, utilizing root work and so forth to poison the so-called slave master, his staff, his family, rout them, free ourselves from enslavement and so forth, poisoning the water supply, the food supply in different cities, killing the majority of the population of the whites and their offspring and so forth. We utilize our ancestral religion to free ourselves. So you can't have a people enslaved when they know exactly who they are. If you give them a fake identity and a foolish set of beliefs associated with that fake identity, like you get with Christianity, Islam, Hebrewism, Judaism, Buddhism, and so forth, then you control the minds of the people. You make them believe that once they die, they're going to go to heaven and, see these fictional characters, or they have a foolish manufactured little, blood circle, and they're just waiting on a savior to come and all this other nonsense, or a Messiah. That's controlling the population. And of course, just like our people were enslaved in North America and the Western Hemisphere, many of our people were colonized on the continent. Those of us who were colonized, they began to learn English, take on English names, or French, or German, or Portuguese, and so forth. And these fake religions were forced on them. Some Christianity was forced on them over the past 100+ years. Some were brainwashed with Islam over the past 1,000+ years. Some were brainwashed with Sephardic Judaism over the past 1,000+ years. So they embraced these fake traditions, rejected their own, and began to try to tie themselves to fictional characters and fictional groups that never existed. The brainwashed individuals who became Muslim try to pretend like they're descended from Arabia. The brainwashed individuals who believe that they were, who embraced the fake tradition of Judaism, Sephardic Judaism, or some other form, they began to try to trace their descent to a fictional group of Hebrews in Israel. Those who were Christians, they tried to say that, even some of them would try to say they were the original Christians in Ethiopia. Pure stupidity. So our people, when you're brainwashed, when you're enslaved, you will look for any other identity to seek to attach yourself to, even though it's fraudulent. When you hate yourself, when you've been conditioned and enslaved and colonized to hate your skin color, hate your lips, hate your hair, hate the shapes of your nose and so forth, and everything about your culture, and you think it's evil, demonic, primitive, backward, regressive, and so forth, then as soon as your enemy gives you the opportunity to identify with something else, anything else than Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit African, if you're enslaved, if you're colonized, you will leap towards that false identity. If they say you're Asiatic, you will leap towards saying you're Asiatic. If they say that you're a Hebrew, you'll leap towards trying to be a fictional Hebrew. If they say that you're a quote unquote Native American, you'll leap towards that and pretend like you're a Native American. You never came from the continent, never had any slavery in your family. If they say you're an extraterrestrial, foolish Negroes are talking about we're extraterrestrials and we came from another star system. Anything other than who we actually are is always based in self-hatred. So this is the origin of our people here in the Western Hemisphere, embracing foolish fake identities, and also people on the continent, like people, the Igbo or the Limba, and some other people pretending like they're descended from a fictional group of Jews or Hebrews who never existed. So we're going to get into the cosmology, but we're also going to get into etymology as well. We call it Aperu, Hebrews never existed, cosmology of the crossover. So first we're going to look at some etymology, but then we're going to go into the cosmology. Now, first, let's look at what some of them would like to say is the origin of a term. And you can find these definitions in various, sites, dictionaries, etymological dictionaries, and so forth. This is just one of many. So people will say that, what is the origin of the term Hebrew? What is the etymology of the term? They'll say passed over, passer over, one who transits, flower forth, deducer, he who looks at something from all sides. But typically, they will say the etymology of the term is from the verb abar, to pass over, and it's really br, to pass over, crossover, and so forth. They'll say the important verb abar means to pass or cross over a river, border, obstacle, or terrain. The derived noun iber describes what or where you end up when you do the verb and so forth. Now, the name Hebrew isn't an abstract label, but much rather an ordinary word used as an appellative, like a nickname or even signature quality. It means passed over, passer over, or transition, one who transits, one from the other side, or even flower forth, deducer, and so forth. That is one of the definitions that you'll see. Let's look at another definition. And you'll find these in various, as we said, different dictionaries and so forth. The information you find in Wikipedia is simply sourced from the most, widespread, quote unquote, scholarly publications on the subject. The modern English term Hebrew, Old French Hebrau, Latin Hebreos, Aramaic Ibre, all ultimately derived from the biblical Hebrew, Ivri. And there's an interchange between the V and the B, as we're going to see. Traditionally understood to be an adjective based on the name of Abraham's, a fictional character, ancestor Eber, mentioned in Genesis. The name is believed to be based on the Semitic root A-B-R, meaning beyond, other side, across. Interpretations of the term generally render its meaning as roughly from the other side of the river, quote unquote, desert, but from across the other side, the ones who crossed over the other side. An exonym for the inhabitants of the land of Israel and Judah, perhaps from the perspective of Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, or Transjordan, with the river being referred to being perhaps the Euphrates, Jordan, or Litani, or maybe the northern Arabian desert. Compare the word Habiru or the cognate Assyrian Ebru of identical meaning. Now, what you'll also find, Hebrew belongs to the Canaanite group of languages. Canaanite languages are a branch of the Northwest Semitic family of languages. in reality, there's really no Hebrew language. That's a later corruption. It's just a corruption of the Kanana, or so-called Canaanite language. Now, so they said, look at the reference for Haberu, or the cognate Assyrian Ebru. So let's switch over to that. Now, so the root is actually, as you saw before, BR, the Semitic root BR, which means to cross over, to cross, to come across, and so forth. And then you also have this term, Aperu. Now, before we get into that, let's look at one more piece. In fact, we can also look at Etym online. Just to give you another. So once again, you'll see Semitic Ibri, ancestral name Eber, one from the other side, perhaps in reference to the river Euphrates, or perhaps simply signifying immigrant, region on the other side or opposite side. And you always hear this notion of crossing over. Now, the name Hebrew comes from the verb abar, meaning to pass over, pass through. So they're talking about, in the fictional account, that Abraham and his people came from Ur of the Chaldees, and they crossed over, and they talk about the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates and so forth, and they crossed over and ended up in what is now called Palestine or Israel, ancient Canaan, and so forth. That's what they're doing. So first, let us go to you look at these terms, they are not Hebrew terms. They're corruptions of terms from our language. So the quote unquote Semitic root, the BR root, in ancient Kamit is Pear. So just like they said, Eber, and the root is BR, the consonantal structure. There are no vowels in the Hebrew, quote unquote Hebrew language. They have the consonantal structure of BR and so forth. So BR, Ber, or Ba, this is why they have Abar or Eber and so forth, to cross over. The group of individuals who crossed over, they left Mesopotamia and they crossed over and they ended up in Mesopotamia, around where Iraq is now. They left that area and crossed over into the region of which, is Palestine. Eventually, they would be given, quote unquote, Palestine by the fake God, this fictional group of people saying, this is the promised land and you are crossing over into this area. So they left immigrants crossing over the river, coming from the other side and so forth, coming into something, Bear to cross over, Bear, an immigrant, Bear to leave one's country and come into another place and cross over into a new beginning and so forth. So when you look at the original terminology from ancient Kamit that they stole, in the Medutu, the hieroglyphic dictionary, you see Pear, to go out, to go forth, to go away, to depart, to leave one's country, to withdraw from a place, to proceed from, to be born, to arise from, to flow out, to empty itself of a river. You see this structure here and the circular structure. This is the form of the open mouth. It's the ra sound. And this structure is the bird's eye view of a going inside of a room or sanctuary or house. And this is like the doorway. The space in the middle is the doorway. And you're going into the little structure, the house, the Pear. So that's Pear. And they have different spellings of that. But very often the determinative symbol of the two legs walking like this, to go out, to cross over, to leave one's country, to depart and so forth, to pass a limit, to evade a calamity, coming out as well as going in, but to go forth, to come out. This is all talking about crossing. That verb per, to cross, became bear or eber, to cross and so forth. Exit, issue, what comes forth, manifestation, outbreak, offspring, those who come out or go out. They can also be attackers and so forth, the ones who go out to attack. But it's also talking about going and coming out and so forth. Now, they also talked about the ancestor of Abraham being Eber. Let's go back to that real quick. Okay. The definitive origin of the term Hebrew remains uncertain. The biblical term ivri, meaning to traverse, to pass over, is usually rendered in Hebrew as Hebrew and English and so forth, as we said earlier. The most generally accepted hypothesis today is that the text intends ivri, and that's from the term ibri, also written ivri, and we'll see it as when we look in the ancient Kamit. Per or eper is also efre, efer, and so forth. So the same as ivri. We have ipri and ivri. We have the same thing in ancient Kamit. So the br is stolen from the pr in ancient Kamit, but the pr, per, or pere, becomes also fere in the Coptic dialect of ancient Kamit. This is why you have br, bere, and vr, vere, evere, and so forth, but we'll get into that. But the generally accepted hypothesis is it's formed from ever, beyond the cross, to traverse, as a description of migrants from across the river and so forth. Now, it is also supported by the 3rd century BCE Septuagint, which translates ivri to perates, a Greek word meaning one who came across a migrant, from perel, to cross, to traverse. This term perel, to cross or to traverse, of course, the Greeks stole from ancient Kamit, per, and they say perel, to cross, to traverse, talking about people leaving one place, going to another place. To go out, per, and this is actually a house structure. And then the two legs walking are coming out of the house. So we actually have the term per or perel, but we also have the hieroglyph itself, the group of hieroglyphs or medutu themselves that actually describe the sanctuary that you're in and the two legs walking out. They don't have that in Greek. They don't have that in Hebrew. They just know that the term per or pera means to go out, to leave one's country, to cross, to traverse. Why does per or pera mean that? Why doesn't noon mean that? Or si mean that? They can't tell you why the sounds per, p, and r together, per or bear, mean to cross or to leave or go out the country. They can't tell you that because they stole the term from our language. We have the term, the same sounds, we have the actual symbols of the sanctuary that you were in and the two legs walking out, but we also have a cosmology dealing with deities that gave birth to the term. They don't have any of that. They just know that the sounds per means to go out because they learned that when they came in contact with us. So let's get back to that. So that's why they say pedal, stolen from Pear, to cross traverse, as well as some early traditional commentary. Now, Gesenius considers it the only linguistically acceptable hypothesis. The description of peoples and nations from their location from across the river, and we're going to show it has to do with individuals dealing with the ancestral realm, coming from one region of the spirit realm into the physical realm, and going from the physical realm and crossing over into the ancestral realm for a specific cosmological purpose. When someone transitions and their spirit leaves the body and they go to the realm of the ancestresses and ancestors, and they cross over into a specific region of the ancestral realm, you can only be accepted in a specific region of the ancestral realm that's in harmony with the other spiritually cultivated, pristine ancestresses and ancestors. If you pass the test of the balancing of the weighing of the heart, if you didn't live in harmony with divine order on earth, then you're not allowed to dwell with your ancient ancestresses and ancestors in peace and harmony in the ancestral realm. You become an earthbound spirit that's plagued and hanging around the spots where you were killed or where you died and so forth, and plaguing people as they walk by these spots or move into these homes where your spirit is still dwelling, that kind of thing. You're away from the pristine ancestral community. So in order for you to traverse or cross over into a specific region of the ancestral realm, you have to go through a specific spiritual process. That's what this pair talking about crossing over comes from, cosmologically. We're going to get into that. So the description of peoples and nations from their location from across the river. That's also important because there's a sacred river that's a line of demarcation from the physical world to the spirit realm. When someone transitions, they have to get in the sacred river, and the divine ferryman ferries you across that sacred river. You give him the right offering, and you can show that you live in harmony with divine order. He will ferry you across the river in the sacred divine ferry boat. And then you get off that ferry boat, and then you go to the, ancestral community. So that crossing the river, Pera, comes directly from that cosmology. But let's go a little bit further. Now, so a description of peoples and nations from their location from across the river. Often the river Euphrates, sometimes the Jordan River. What's common in this region of the ancient Near East, it appears as Eber Nari in Akkadian and Avar Nahara in Aramaic, both corresponding to Hebrew Ever Nahar. Notice that there's an interchange between the B and the V. And linguistically, in languages across the world, B and V interchange. Eber or Ever, depending on the way people pronounce it. So the Aramaic expressions used being quoted verbatim in the Bible, for example, in an Aramaic letter sent to the king of Persia, in the book of Ezra, or in the book of Nehemiah, sometimes rendered as trans-Euphrates. Some authors argue that Ibri denotes the descendants of the biblical patriarch Eber, son of Shelah, great-grandson of Noah, and an ancestor of Abraham. Hence the occasional anglicization, Eberites. So they'll say it's the name of the ancestor Eber or Eber. It means to cross over. Eber, it means that in Aramaic. It means that in Akkadian, in the Akkadian Empire. And then, of course, the fictional Hebrews take that same term and pretend like it's part of their language, but it existed before this fictional group came into being. The Akkadian Empire is separate from this fictional Hebrew Empire and so forth. It's been around for thousands of years. Centuries and centuries prior to this manufactured Hebrew group and so forth. Eber was a term, and Aramaic is a term and so forth. And of course, we just saw it comes directly from ancient Kamit and Kamit. Now, since the 19th century discovery of the 2nd millennium BCE inscriptions mentioning the Aperu, many theories have linked these to the Hebrews. Some scholars argue that the name Hebrew is related to the name of those semi-nomadic Aperu people recorded in Egyptian inscriptions of the 13th and 12th centuries BCE as having settled in Egypt. Other scholars rebut this, proposing that the Hebrews are mentioned in later texts of the 3rd intermediate period and so forth. While some scholars consider these hypotheses compatible, Aperu being generic Akkadian, and then talking about the equivalent of Ever, beyond, cross, and so forth. So what has happened? Let's just go back real quick. And we're going to get into this cosmology. So they don't know, for them, they'll talk about they don't know the origin of the term. They see it in the so-called Hebrew language, but they also see it in other nations like the Akkadian Empire, in different nations of the Near East and so forth. And then they saw that you have the term in ancient Kamit. So they didn't want to fully go down that road because that destroys their entire myth, which we're going to destroy tonight. So, but when they started looking around and archaeologists began to, dig up, different sites and archaeological sites in so-called Israel and so forth, archaeology in reality began because Europeans were trying to prove that the stories in the Bible were accurate. And what they found was that none of these characters existed. There's no evidence of any of these characters existing, including, of course, Jesus and Muhammad and all these other characters. But when you talk about the Moses story, the Exodus, this is the founding myth of the so-called Hebrew people. Without Moses and liberating the children of Israel and the promised land, them going to, so-called, Canaan, Palestine, Israel, and so forth, and establishing a nation and God giving them that, without all of that, then there's no such thing as Judaism, Hebrewism, and so forth. Everything they're talking about, and also later, Christianity, Islam, and so forth, it all falls apart if Moses doesn't exist, if the Exodus never happened. So archaeologists began digging up places all over so-called Israel and so forth, and throughout the Near East and into ancient Kemet, because they were trying to prove that this was real. The fact that there are Jews and, Palestinians fighting over Israel right now, all of them are invaders. There were no ancient Hebrews, that's fiction. These Arabs who are quote unquote Muslims and so forth, talking about they belong there, they were white invaders. Prior to the Europeans, Black people were populating the entire portion of Southern Europe, into the Near East, into the East and so forth, as well as Afuraitkaitnut, Africa. They are white, cave-dwelling Europeans, Euro beasts from Northern Eurasia who invaded, learned about religion from our people, and began to corrupt these different traditions and manufacturing little characters to try to make our people follow them. Now, the Exodus Hebrew myth is the founding myth of the Israelites, whose narrative is spread over 4 books of the Torah and so forth. And we know the story about, Moses being born and placed in a basket, a bulrush basket and so forth. And the princess, the Kameti or Egyptian princess, finds him and names him Moses. And he's raised up, and he's a little Hebrew baby raised up and so forth. Ends up leaving, going out into the wilderness, goes on the mountain, sees the God in the form of a divine light or a burning bush and so forth, is told he has a little mission, then goes back, liberates the people, and brings them to the quote unquote promised land. We know that whole false story. Now, they talk about the narrative here, and what's important as far as timing is this section. The Pharaoh becomes concerned by the number and strength of the Israelites in Egypt and enslaves them, commanding them to build at 2 supplier store cities And in the Bible, they talk about the store cities of Pithom and Rameses in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. Now, Pithom is from Pear Atem, or the house of the deity Atem in ancient Kamit, house of the god Atem, a city mentioned once in the Bible as one of the 2 treasury cities. Also see Ramses and so forth, or Ramesu. There were 9 Ramesu or Ramses kings in ancient Kemet, but they would say the cities of Pithom and Ramses, or Per Atem and Ramesu. That gives a date. So when they say Moses was there and the children of Israel were there at that particular time, and they were building the cities of Per Atem or Ramesu or Pithom and Ramses. Now they're giving you a time frame. They were looking, we had the most meticulous records, trustorical records, business records, and so forth in ancient Kemet. So when they're trying to build a timeline for their fake religion, since nothing was happening in so-called Israel, all these little, groups and interactions and so forth, there's no real historical record there because they're manufacturing a religion, manufacturing a people, manufacturing personalities. So they have to get a real historical record, a historical timeline of different kings and what happened and what nations they were controlling and so forth. And ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, had vassal states that they were controlling all the way up through the Near East into Syria and so forth. So their history of their different kings and what happened and the wars that happened, they look at that real history and then they pull out certain time frames and then they stick themselves and say, oh, we were living here at that particular time. That's like if somebody read the history of a certain region in China over the past 20 years, and then you read the history that there was a certain group that was controlling this region of China and Wuhan, China, and so forth over the past 20 years. And then you wrote a story about Wuhan, China, and then you stuck your family in that story and said, yeah, we were living there. In fact, the proof that we were living there over the past 20 years is because this happened this date and this happened this date. And if people looked up those different dates and those different events, they would say, wow, those things did happen. We saw that on the news. There's recordings of that. Maybe they were living in Wuhan. But in reality, you manufactured a fictional family and stuck yourself in Wuhan, China over the past 20 years because you read about their history, wrote down all the different dates of things that actually happened, and then stuck yourself in between that and pretended like you were there. This is exactly what the Europeans did with ancient Canaan, so-called Canaan. They stuck themselves there, but they had to give them a name, give themselves a name, and tried to give themselves a history that didn't exist. But they put the timestamp, Pithom and Rameses. Why is that important? The reason why that's important is because when you look at this particular text, and this is an image from the tomb of the Pear Pharaoh Tutankhamen. It is a text called the Book of the Cow of Heaven, or the Book of the Heavenly Cow. And that same text you find in the tomb of Seti, and it's written here. That entire text is written on the walls in these different tombs. Now, when we traveled to Kamit, we went to the tomb of Seti, we went to the tomb of Tutankhamen. You will go to those tombs as well, and you will see this for yourself. You travel with us. We're going back to Kamit in May if you'd like to join us and so forth. But what's important about that, this entire text called the Book of the Cow of Heaven is where they stole the Moses story from. They took the story of deities functioning in creation, took the names and functions of deities and attached them to fictional characters and stuck them in Palestine. But we have the original text. Now let's look at the Book of the Cow of Heaven real quick. This is a drawing of what we just showed you. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, or Book of the Cow of Heaven, is an ancient Egyptian or Kemetic text thought to have originated during the Amarna period and in part describes the reasons for the imperfect state of the world in terms of humankind's rebellion against the supreme deity. It's not the sun god, it's really Ra. A number of different things. Though the text is recorded in the New Kingdom period, it is written in Middle Egyptian and may have been written during the Middle Kingdom period. Now, here's the important part. The Book of the Heavenly Cow was included in the tombs of Tutankhamen, as we just showed you, that image. The tomb of Seti I, just showed you that image, as well as Ramesu, they say Ramses II, but Ramesu II, Ramesu III, Ramesu VI. The earliest known copy of the Book of the Heavenly Cow was discovered in the outermost gilded shrine of Tutankhamen. Why is that important? Tutankhamen, the boy king and so forth. His reign was 1332 to 1323, so-called BCE. That is the New Kingdom, so-called 18th dynasty. That's when he lived. So that Book of the Heavenly Cow, you find that in his particular tomb and so forth. Hold on 1 second, I want to pull up this. During the 1332 to 1323. Now, that's the 18th dynasty. These are the Pear, so-called pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. Amensu I, Amenhotep I, Tutmose I, Tutmose II, the Queen Hatshepsut, Tutmos the third, and then you get to Tutankhamen. He only lived a short period. He died young and so forth. Then I came after him. After him, Horemheb. That's the 18th dynasty. And then we get into the 19th dynasty. And when you look at the kings of the 19th dynasty, Ramesu I, or Ramses I, Ramesu II, and then you get to the 20th dynasty, you get Ramesu III, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way through to Ramesu IX. Ramesu I is 1292 to 1290 BC. So the reason why that's important is because the Book of the Cow of Heaven, the origin of this fictional Moses story, talking about deities, it existed. The first rendering of it you find with Tutankhamen. This is before Ramesu was so-called Ramses. So when they place the little Moses story, and they talk about the Israelites were building the cities of Pear, Atem, and Ramses, well, the story we're about to read existed before that. And when you find out that the Moses character was stolen from this, divinity prior to Pithom and Rameses, or Pear, Atem, and Ramesu, then this story is older than the little fictional Moses story. That's why it's important. So let's look at the Book of the Cow of Heaven. Pull this up real quick. So it's a translation and transliteration. You can find this in many books and so forth. Of course, we have our 2-part course on reading and writing the Medutu, the Ntoro, the language of ancient Kamit and so forth. You can take that course. Those 2 courses are archived, 6-week courses and so forth. So there are a couple of things going on with this particular text. So let's get into it. So what you see is the translation, transliteration. They have the Medutu, the hieroglyphs on one page, the translation on the other page. Now, in the beginning of the text, and sometimes they call this particular text, as you can see, the legend of the destruction of mankind. And it talks about a period when certain men and women were going against Ra, the creator of the universe. Ra is the creator and Ra is the creatress. And since they were going against the creator of the universe, the creator Ra called the council of the deities to come together to see what needed to be done. There was groups of men and women, certain group of men and women who were creating disorder on earth and so forth, destroying, pillaging, and all different kinds of things. He called a council of divinities to come together to see what needed to take place. So when they talk about, here's the story of Ra, the God who was self-begotten and self-created after he had assumed the sovereignty over men and women and gods and things, the one or unique divinity, not one as in solo, but the unique one. Certain men and women were speaking words of complaint. And we're not going to go through all of that portion, but he says, cry out and bring to me my eye and Shu and Tefnut and Seb and Nut and the father gods and the mother gods who were with me, even when I was in Nu side by side with my God Nu, and they brought all these deities together. And let's just go to the next section. The gods were drawn up on each side of Ra. They bowed down before his majesty until their heads touched the ground. And then he spoke saying, those who were created by my eye, the men and women who came into being that he created and so forth, some of them uttering words of complaint and projecting negative energy, creating disorder in the world and so forth. He asked the council of his elders and eldresses, this is the creator of the universe, asking his elders and eldresses, this is what's taking place. Before I make a move, I want to know what you have to say about it. Then the majesty of the deity Nu, the father of Ra, he said to his son Ra, you're the God who's greater than he who made you. And he basically says, you can eliminate these disordered men and women. So, and I just want you to see an image for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is one of our books, but this is the image of the deity Ra, the creator of the universe, with his sacred animal totem form of the falcon. And this is Ra'et, the creatress of the universe. And Ra and Ra'et work together as 2 halves of the divine whole, the spirit of the supreme being, the divine living energy permeating all of creation, the divine living energy that animates all created entities in creation. That's Ra and Ra'et. They will utilize the sun and other stars to transmit their spiritual energy, but they are not the sun god and the sun goddess, as most Egyptologists would say. And moreover, just so you can see the relationship, this is Amen, this is Amenet, that's the great father and great mother supreme being, and they give birth ultimately to Ra and Ra'et, the creator and creatress. Just like you're a being, you have divine living energy surging through you, spiritual force, and you direct that spiritual force to create for you and so forth. Your life force energy, Amen and Amenet are the great mother and great father supreme being, and the life force energy within their great divine body, their creative power, and procreative power is Ra and Ra'at. And they direct their Ra and Ra'at force to create the universe and replenish the universe and so forth. So the great being directs their life force energy, just like you as a being direct your life force energy, just like someone doing, martial arts or certain movements, and they move the energy through their body and so forth. You're the great being like Amen or Amenet, the black man and black woman and so forth, and you direct your solar fire energy that surges through every cell in your body. You direct that energy to create for you. That is your Ra force if you're the male, the Ra'at force if you're the female. Now, so just to give you some background on that. So in this portion of the story, Ra gets, the approval from the elders and eldresses. He sends out the female divinity Sekhmet, the lioness divinity, the warrioress. She kills the disordered men and women, the vast majority of them. And that, takes care of most of the problem. So, and also just so you can see that as well, just want you to see her. It's the lioness goddess Sekhmet. She comes into being from the Eye of Ra and so forth and goes out and slays the disordered men and women. That's what's happening in the text. That's the first portion of the text. Now, then we get to the part that we need to get to today, but you did need to know that background. So we don't have to read too much of it. We just want to get to the important part. In fact, let's read the little end portion. So there were some other men and women who saw what happened, saw Sekhmet go and destroy the disordered men and women, the uncultivated criminal men and women and so forth. And there were other men and women who were loyal to the creator. And these men and women said, remain with us, talking about Ra, and we will overthrow your enemies who speak words of blasphemy against you and destroy them. Then His Majesty Ra set out for the great house, and the gods who were in the train or following of Ra remained with them, the men and women. During that time, the earth was in darkness. That's like the sun going into an eclipse and so forth, and everything was in darkness. When the earth became light again, and the morning had dawned, the men came forth with their bows and their weapons, and they set their arms in motion to shoot the enemies of Ra. Then the majesty of this God said, your transgressions of violence are placed behind you, for the slaughtering of the enemies is above the slaughter of sacrifice. Thus came into being the slaughter of sacrifice. And the majesty of this God said unto the goddess Nut, I have placed myself on your back. Now, and here's the key piece that we need to deal with for the rest of this session. Then the majesty of this God said, I am departing from them, meaning those certain disordered men and women, and he must come after me who would see me. At this time, Ra was ruling on earth from the shrine in ancient Kemet and the palace and throne in ancient Kemet and so forth. When people go into the shrine house, just like you can go into a spiritual house in African religion right now, ancestral religion right now, you'll see a shrine and so forth. People pour libation, engage in ritual song, ritual dance, and the spirit will come down and possess the individual. The spirit is housed at the shrine and so forth. And they would get, answers when the person is in spirit possession. Ra's ruling on earth at this particular time. But then he says, instead of ruling on earth, I am departing from them, and he must come after me who would see me. So he goes up further into the heavenly realm, and he's going to rule from the heavenly realm, and he's going to allow human kings and queens to rule on earth. So this is what's taking place. Those who would, he must come after me who would see me. If you want to, live in harmony with Ra, now you have to go into the spirit realm so you can get that direction from Ra and so forth. You can't just go to the palace and see him like that. Now, the majesty of this God looked forth from its interior, saying, gather together men for me and make ready for me an abode for multitudes. And thus came into being. And his majesty said, let a great field, Sekhet, be produced, Hetep. Thereupon the Sekhet Hetep, the divine field, Sekhet, of peace and offerings, Hetep, came into being. And the God said, I will gather herbs, Arat, therein. Thereupon the Sekhet Aru, the field, Sekhet of Aru, came into being. There's the divine food in the divine field. I will make it to contain as dwellers things like stars of all sorts. Thereupon the stars Akeka came into being. Now, so what he said was, I'm leaving, I'm going up into the heavenly realm. If you want to see me, you must come to where I'm at. You need to come into the spirit realm to get realigned with the divinity instead of just going to the palace and so forth and the shrine there. I'm going to set up a divine space called the Sekhet Hetep, the divine field, Sekhet of Hetep, peace and offerings, and I'm going to put sacred food within there. I just developed the promised land and this promise for those who will come and follow after me. This is what I just set up, the great divine field of peace. So we saw Sekhet Hetep. Let's check that out real quick. What is the Sekhet Hetep? In fact, let's go back real quick. In Egyptian mythology, we just saw Aru. He said we'll gather herbs and food and so forth. That plant life, Aru, and the Sekhet Aru came into being. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Aru, known as the Sekhet Aru, the field of reeds, is the heavenly paradise where Osar, misnomer Osiris, rules. It has been described as the Ka, the soul of the Nile Delta. Now, let's go a little bit further. The Egyptian afterlife, the field of reeds. We're talking about the spirit realm when someone transitions, the quote unquote afterlife. Ancient Kamit people believed that life on earth was only one part of an eternal journey, which ended not in death, but in everlasting joy, and so forth. Now, if one were justified by, when death came, it was only a transition to another realm, transition or crossing over to another realm. If one were justified by the deities, one would live eternally in a paradise known as the field of reeds. The field of reeds, sometimes called the field of offerings. Sekhet Aru is the field of reeds. Sekhet Hetep is the field of offerings, and the Sekhet Hetep, as we just saw in the text. And let's look back in this text real quick. Gather together and make ready for me an abode or multitudes. Let a great field, Sekhet, be produced, Hetep. Thereupon the Sekhet Hetep came into being. I will gather herbs, Arat, therein. Thereupon the Sekhet Aru came into being, as you can see right here. So the field of reeds or herbs, the plant life, is part and placed within the great field, Sekhet, of Hetep, peace and offerings. Now, the field of reeds, sometimes called the field of offerings, meaning Sekhet Aru, Sekhet Hetep, known to the Egyptians as Aru, was a mirror image of one's life on earth. The aim of every ancient Kameti person, misnomer Egyptian, but Kameti person, was to make that life worth living eternally. And as far as the records indicate, they did their very best at that. This is a man plowing the sacred fields in the afterlife. So just like in the Akan tradition, they say if you want to know what the ancestral realm is like, consider the dream state. When you go to bed, you go to sleep and you dream, your body's laying in a dark space. There's no sound, there's no light, there's no movement, but you're interacting. You're seeing people, individuals, entities, you're interacting, you're hearing, you're engaging and so forth, because you're engaging with very often the spirits of ancestresses and ancestors or other individuals. Now, the same thing happens after death. The body's in a dark place. There's no movement, no sound, no light, but your spirit is interfacing with other ancestral spirits who have also transitioned. So the dream state is akin to the after death state and so forth. So just like in the dream state, you can come in contact with other individuals that you've communicated with before. You can come in contact with ancestors and ancestresses. When we transition, the ancestral realm is a mirror of this realm. If you live in harmony with divine order, you're allowed to participate and dwell with your spiritually cultivated class of ancestresses and ancestors who came before you in that space. If you didn't live in harmony with order, you're not allowed to dwell with them. You're repelled from that, and you're forced to be earthbound as a spirit. If you transition at a hospital, your spirit is hanging around the hospital. If you died by committing suicide, jumping off of a bridge and so forth, your spirit is still hanging around the bridge. You died in a home, your spirit is still hanging around the home that you died in and so forth. If you were gunned down at a stop sign, your spirit is still hanging around that spot and distracting people when they're driving and so forth. All these different kinds of things. You're an earthbound spirit. It's no different than in the physical realm. If you knew that your family was having a big family reunion and everybody was going to be there, it was going to be a joyous time and so forth. If you were somebody who stole from the family, were hooked on drugs or engaged in criminal activity and so forth, when you began to walk towards that house, family members would come out. You would not be allowed to dwell in that space. You would not be allowed to interface in that space. You would be repelled by the entire group. You would not be allowed to interact with anybody in that space. You're banned from that space. You're repelled from that space. The same happens when we live in harmony with divine order. We're drawn to live amongst the ancestral spirits in the ancestral realm. If we were operating in disorder and criminality, then our spirits are repelled. We can't even get close to that realm, the Sekhet Hetep, the Sekhet Aru. We're not allowed to cross into that realm. So we become an earthbound, negative spirit. So that's just a specific scene right there. They have some more scenes here. These are more scenes of the afterlife when they're, gathering herbs and gathering fruit and harvesting and so forth in the spirit realm, these different kinds of things. All right. So you just saw that Ra declared, because he destroyed certain disordered men and women, but he said, you know what, I'm going to go into the spirit realm. I'm going to establish a great expanse of space. I'm going to put divine food. It's going to be a paradise and so forth. If you want to come to connect with me, you need to come to me in this spiritual place, the Sekhet Hetep, with the divine food therein, in the heavenly realm, the spirit realm. Now, the next phase Now we get to the most important part. But you did need that background to understand what's happening. So Ra decides that he's not going to any longer participate ruling on the earth as, sovereign. The majesty of this God said, call to me the deity or the god Tehuti, who the Greeks call Thoth, as you can see right here. And one brought the god to him forthwith, and the majesty of this god, meaning the majesty of Ra, said unto Thoth or Tehuti, and this is the critical piece, let us depart to a distance from heaven from my place, because I will make light as the god of light, Aku, in the Duat and in the land of caves. And the Duat is the mountainous region and so forth of the spirit realm. So he's saying to Tehuti, the divinity Tehuti, here it is. He said, hey, somebody bring Tehuti, tell him to come to me. Tehuti comes to him and he says, let's depart from here. We're going up into the land of caves, the mountains and so forth. I'm going to make a divine light called Aku. Later in the text, Ra calls himself, in that context, he calls himself Ra Aku, meaning Ra, the illuminated one who takes the form of divine light. And once they get up into that region, he tells Tehuti, thou shalt, or you shall write down the things that are in this realm and so forth, and you shall punish those who are in it, that is to say, oh, my bad. Okay. You should punish those who are in it. That is to say, the workers who have worked iniquity or rebellion. And then Ra says, the creator says, was taking the form of a divine light. Through you, I will keep away from the servants whom this heart of mine loathes. You shall be in my place, Asti, and you shall therefore be called O Tehuti, the Asti of Ra. So he tells Tehuti, he already decided he's going up into the heavenly realm. He's not going to rule on earth anymore. He's placing the divinity of divine wisdom Tehuti in his place to represent him on earth. He told Tehuti to write down what is in the spirit realm and to punish those who went against divine order. But he's going to be in the place of Ra on earth while Ra's in the heavenly realm and so forth. And that's why he's called Asti, meaning the throne of Ra and so forth. He says, moreover, I give you the power to send forth. And there came into being the Habi, or Habui, the ibis bird of Tehuti. And let's look at what that means. Now, this is the deity Tehuti. Tehuti is the divine. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, this is one of our books. We wrote this book talking about the deity Tehuti. Now we're showing that this divinity Tehuti, and he's very often shown as the body of a man and the head of the sacred Habui bird, so-called ibis and so forth. We were showing that this divinity Tehuti was also called Fa in ancient Kamit. He's also called Fa in Vodun and Ifa in Yoruba and Sankofa in Akan and so forth. So we were showing that in this particular book, but And we're going into some etymology and so forth, but Tehuti he's the divine scribe. He's the deity of divine wisdom. He's the mouthpiece or the spokesperson of the king and queen mother of the great divinity and so forth. He's the one who speaks the divine words. He's the voice of the king. So for example, in our Khan culture, when you have a king, and we will pull this up real quick. When you have a king and queen mother, people do not speak directly to the king or queen mother. They speak to the spokesperson, then the spokesperson whispers in the ear. This is a spokesperson of a king. Hold on, let me make sure you can see that. All right. This is an article we published. This is in the Akan tradition. The spokesperson with the staff is the Ocheame. This is the Ohini, the king seated on the throne. The king is a sacred entity, just like the queen mother is sacred. So people don't speak directly to the king or queen mother, the Ohini or Hima. They speak to the Ocheame, the spokesperson. Then he speaks to the king whispers in his ear, and then he declares or speaks the words of the sovereign. And that's the interchange that people have. He is the Ocheame of the king. Ocheame means the spokesperson of the sacred in the Akan language. The reason why we showed that is because Tehuti is the original spokesperson or person of divine wisdom who speaks the wisdom of the sovereign. This is why we have a staff with the spokesperson in Akan that replicates the staff of Tehuti, the divinity of divine wisdom. Now, Ocheame, a speaker, reporter, interpreter, one of the elders of a king or Negro town or community. This is an old dictionary that was, laying this out. Has the office of a speaker, being the mouthpiece of or reporter to the king or the assembly. He also receives and deflects negative spiritual energy, which may be directed at the Ohini, the king, by malevolent individuals. So he receives the complaints of the people and says, this is what the people want. Listen to the king. He speaks in his ear and he says, this is what's going to be done. If somebody's projecting negative energy at the king with his staff, he's an elder. He knows how to wield and protect and deflect that negative energy that somebody will project to try to kill the king and so forth. He can receive it and deflect it and protect the king as well. So he receives the complaints and the issues of the people and so forth, but he also receives any negative energy and deflects that. He has a critical political and spiritual function. That term is Ocheame in Akan. In ancient Kamit, Uhem, which is pronounced Uchem, to repeat, narrate, to recount, tell a story. Uchemu, the teller, the recorder, the proclaimer. Uchem Nesu, the king's spokesperson, the king's herald or crier or spokesperson in chief. Ochem-a, the great recorder. So Ochema in ancient Kamit is Ocheame in Akan. That is the spokesperson, the king's herald or chief herald or crier or speaker, the one who speaks, records, proclaims, and so forth. So Ochem-a in ancient Kamit is Ocheame in Akan. If you look at the term Ocheme in Akan, which is Ocheame in Akan, but Ocheme in Akan, that's Ocheme or Ochema in ancient Kamit. It means the king's recorder, speaker, proclaimer, to repeat, to narrate, to recount, and so forth. It's the same function. And here you have the king and the king's spokesperson, Ocheme, Just like in Akan, you have the king, the Ohini, and the Ochiame, the same thing. And that's important. We just talked about Ra being called Ra'aku, but when we go back to our story, now you have a better understanding of that cosmological context. Ra says he wanted to create a field, divine field, Sekhetetep. If you want to come to connect with him, you need to go into the spirit realm to do so. He said, through you, talking about Tehuti, the divine scribe, the one that scribes down the divine laws, you see him with his pen scribing. He's the divine sesh or scribe. He said, through you, I will keep away from the servants whom this heart of mine loathes. Tehuti is the one who speaks for the king and so forth. He's going to be in his place. He speaks for the king. But he also keeps away those individuals whose the heart of the king loathes. The ones who were projecting that negative spiritual energy towards the king, and he killed most of them. There were a few that were left over. He said, I loathe those individuals. You're going to be my representative. You're going to keep those individuals away. You're going to deflect their energy away. You're the Ucheyame. You're my spokesperson. You're my representative. And you also keep the negative energy away. So Tehuti, the divinity of divine wisdom, the spokesperson or mouthpiece of the sovereign and so forth. You have to be wise to bring those words out and so forth. He was given power. He was given position. He was given the habui bird, which is the sacred ibis bird that you saw, the crane and so forth. That's a sacred animal totem. I give you the power to lift up your hand before the two companies of the deities who are greater than you. And then he also says, therefore shall the divine bird Tekni of Tehuti come into being, another sacred animal totem. Moreover, I give you power to embrace, the word embrace Ankh, the two heavens with your beauties and with your rays of light. Therefore shall come into being the moon god, Yah of Tehuti. Let's get into that real quick. Just so you can see that. This is one image of the divinity. As you can see, Yah, I-A-H, also written Y-A-H, Yah. And of course, that later becomes Jah and Jehovah and Yah and Yahweh and so forth. But Yah is the moon deity, a lunar deity in ancient Kamiti religion. The word Yah simply means moon, is also transcribed as Yah, Jah, well, two A's, Yah, and so forth. So Yah was sometimes considered an adult form of Cain-Su, a different divinity, but Yah is the moon divinity. As time went on, Yah also became Yah Jehuti, meaning the god of the new moon. In this role, he assumed the lunar aspect of Tehuti, the deity of divine wisdom. So Tehuti is called Yah. Now, let's switch over. In fact, let's switch back over to the KUKUU-TUNTUM real quick. Here's the divinity Tehuti. He has the crescent moon on his head. You see, this is the actual stele from Neferenpet that this drawing is taken from. You also see him with the moon on his head, and he is called Yah Tehuti. In fact, we're going to get into the spelling of that name, but that's Yah Tehuti. As a matter of fact, let's look real quick. Well, before we get to that, let's get back to the text. So the moon divinity is given to him. He's called Yah Tehuti. And then the next part is, moreover, I give you power to drive back Anan, the Ha, Nebu, which means those who are invading from the north and so forth. Therefore shall come into being the dog-headed ape, Anan of Tehuti, and he shall act as governor for me. It then says, moreover, you are now in my place in the sight of all those who see you and who present offerings to you, and every being shall ascribe praise unto you, O you who are God. So let's look at the dog-headed ape real quick. We just saw him. This is the quote-unquote dog-headed ape, Anan, as you just saw. So you have Tehuti and Anan. So to recap, Ra, men and women were destroying, creating disorder. He brought Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, to kill most of them. She slaughtered most of them, not all of them, but most of them. So he said, I'm no longer going to rule on earth. The text, and this text is written before Ramses existed, before the cities of Pithom and Rameses, of Pear, and Rameses, and so forth. He says, I'm going to create a great field, a great space. Sekhetetep. It has sacred offerings. It has divine food within it, and stars and all kinds of things are in this great space. This is the paradise. This is the land that you will be able to come to me if the people follow Tehuti. He established a promised land. The great God established a promised land. Then he said to Tehuti, you come over here. We need to go up into the caves and so forth, because I am going to take the form of Ra-Aku, a god of light. Now let's go back to that. In fact, in the next section, so he's given the dog-headed ape Anan. So you have Tehuti and Anan, and they are, they're going to be in control because Ra is up in the heavens and so forth. And then he says, you are now in my place in the sight of all those who see you and who present offerings to you, and every being shall ascribe praise unto you, O you who are God. Now, anybody who wants to communicate with me, they're going to communicate with me through you, because when they see you, they see me and so forth, that you're my representative. And I also gave you an assistant, Anan, the dog-headed baboon, who's a divinity as well. I gave him as an assistant. Now, the next portion of the text is an instruction. Second. Okay. The next portion of the text is an instruction. Shrink that back up. So the next portion says, whosoever shall recite the words of this composition over himself shall anoint himself with olive oil and with thick unguent, and he shall have propitiatory offerings on both his hands of incense, and behind his 2 ears shall be pure, and so forth. So this is a text that you see on the walls, but the priests and priestesses would read the text as a ritual invocation. And when they're reading this text, they're giving you the instruction of what you need to do. You're using the olive oil, you're doing all these different things and anointing yourself. It says, he shall be arrayed in a new double tunic, and his body shall be purified with the water of the Nile flood, and he shall have upon his feet a pair of sandals made of white leather, and the figure of the goddess Ma'at shall be drawn upon his tongue with green-colored ochre. Whensoever Tehuti shall wish to recite this composition on behalf of Ra, he must perform a sevenfold purification for 3 days, and priests and ordinary men shall do likewise. So it's given all these different instructions about what you're going to do when you read this particular text. Hold on 1 second. Then the next part says, the aged one himself, Ra, embraced the divinity Nu, spoke to the deities, and he started talking about, who he is and what his function in the world is. And he talks about he's the spirit that dwells in all the different divinities and the spirit that pervades the entire world. And then the instructions come again. Whosoever says these words works his own protection by means of the words of power. And the words of power, the protection, the ritual invocation says, I am the god Hekau, the divine word of power, and I am pure in my mouth and in my belly or gut and so forth. I am Ra, from whom the gods proceeded. I am Ra, the light god Aku, meaning Ra Aku. And let me just go back to that portion just so you can see that. So when he said he went on top of the mountain with Tehuti and took the form of divine light, this is the spelling in that particular text when he called himself Ra Aku, or Ra, the illuminated one. And of course, he has the solar disk on his head and so forth, but Aku, the fiery light of the sun, the flame goddess, the fire you raised on the pharaoh's crown, the name of the royal crown and so forth. Aku, fire. Aku, to shine, to be bright, fine, splendid, glorious, excellent, good, to be useful, recite formulae. Aku, light, splendor, brilliance, radiance, and you see the sun disk with the rays coming out and so forth. Aku, the light god, the great light, talking about the sun, but Aku is also the term for fire, and this is actually a lamp with smoke coming out of a burning lamp or brazier and so forth, and it's a fire burning with the smoke coming out. Aku. So he's called Ra Aku. Now, why is that important? There's a divinity and the creator of the universe who decides to say, I'm going to create a great field. I'm going to promise this land to those who follow my representative. I'm going to put my representative on earth. He's going to be the leader. I'm going to give him an assistant, that dog-headed baboon, Anan. They're going to be the leaders. If you follow him, when they see you, Tehuti, they see me. If they follow you, then they can come to me and they can come to the Sekhet Hetep, the divine field of peace and paradise, and the Sekhet Aru, with the fields of herbs and reeds and so forth. They have access to the promised land through you. How did he first give him that? He said, come with me up into the mountains. I'm going to take the form of a divine light. Now, and he gave him these instructions. And let's just put in one more piece so you can understand. Let me just show this. I just want you to see something that goes directly to it. So Okay. Tehuti, misnomer Thoth, was a god of the moon, sacred texts, mathematics, the sciences, magic messenger, and recorder of the deities, master of knowledge, and patron of the scribes. His name was Tehuti, Jehuti, which means he who is like the ibis and so forth. He was depicted as an ibis and so forth. Now, he was a divine scribe, so you see him as you see him with the sacred writing stylus. Tehuti is a divine scribe, and Seshat is the female divinity of divine wisdom. She's a divine scribe as well. They write down your entire life function and so forth. He measures the planets, moons, suns, stars, the measurements of all things in creation and so forth. He's the divine scribe. He writes down the divine law. This is why Ra tells him, you're going to write down what's in the spirit realm. Get back to that page. So we have that entire story. What's most important, however, is one of his titles. And that is Ma'al Sheru, or Ma'al Sher. Ma'al means true or truth, but also means divine law. And Sher, Cheru, means voice or word. Tehuti is Ma'al Sher, or Ma'al Sheru, one who voices or speaks. Sher, voices. Ma'al, the divine law, or that which is true. And he has the capacity to make others Ma'al Sheru. Ma'al Sher means true word, truthful, lawful voice. So, Tehuti is operating through the moon. Ra's operating through the sun. At nighttime, of course, when you see the moon is illuminate, it is receiving the light of the sun and transmitting it to those of us who are on earth who are in darkness. And the moon there, even though the sun has gone away and we're still on earth and we're in darkness, the moon will be filled up with the sun's light and illuminates our path in the darkness so we can find our way through the darkness. Wisdom is illumination. And if you receive wisdom because you're in the darkness of ignorance, once you receive the light of wisdom, you can navigate your way through life without harming yourself because you received wisdom and it illuminated your darkness. When the moon goes up with the sun and there's an eclipse and so forth, the sun transmits its energy to the moon, even though the sun is gone and you don't know where the sun is, quote unquote, but the moon is there and it's the representative of the light when you're in darkness. And people who are moving around, they can see their way around, they don't hurt themselves, or they can avoid, dangerous animals or anything else because their path has been illuminated. So the moon goes up into the mountains where the sun is. There's a fusion of the sun and moon and so forth. There's a distribution of or transmission or dispensation of that light given to the moon and so forth. And then the moon can shine that on the people and lead the people and so forth. That's one aspect of it. But the reason why it's important, of course, is because Ma'al Sher, the great divine scribe, the one with all the divine wisdom, the one who speaks for the king and so forth, he's called Ma'al Sher, true of word, true of voice. But Ma'al Sher is where they corrupted Ma Sher or Ma She from. Moshe, in quote unquote Hebrew, is really M-S-H and so forth, but it's Moshe. That's how they pronounce it. That comes from Ma Sher. And then his representative, his assistant is Anan. That's Moshe and Anan. That becomes Moshe and Aran, or Moses and Aaron. So Moses goes up on the mountain. He sees the God in the form of a divine light or a burning bush. He's told he's going to be the representative or the lawgiver. The word ma'al in ancient Kamit means law. And let's just prove that real quick. Okay, so the ma'al, God of law, order, truth, integrity. The goddess Ma'at, female, a goddess personification of law, order, rule, truth, and so forth. Of course, we have the term Ma'al, Sheru, also spelled Ma'al, Sher without the U. And what does that mean? True of voice or word in the judgment, to be innocent, meaning lived in harmony with divine order. The feminine version is Ma'at, Sheru. So there's Ma'al, Sher, which is Moshe, and corrupted into Moshe and Moses, but that's Moshe. That's the male title. And then you have Ma'at, Keru, or Ma'at, Sher. There's a female Ma'at, Sher. There's male Moses and a female Moses. Every person who dies, and we're going to get into this next week with the balancing of the heart against the feather on the scales of Ma'at and so forth. If you lived in harmony with divine order, Tehuti will adjudicate the matter and declare you to be Ma'al Sher, or true of word, one who voices or speaks, share the divine law. Once you're declared that, then you're allowed to live with the ancestresses and ancestors, your relatives, in peace in the Sekhet Hetep, the divine field. You're allowed into the promised land. The land is promised to you if you live in harmony with divine order, if you follow Tehuti throughout the course of your life, and you can prove that after death, then you can cross over Aperu, you can cross the river, that divine river, into the ancestral realm, and you can get to that point. So the divinity Tehuti, Ma'al Sher, and his assistant Anan is corrupted into Moshe and Anan, or Moses and Aaron, or Moses and Aaron. So you have an individual who's told, comes from Kamit, Egypt, quote unquote, goes up into the mountains. The god takes the form of the divine light or a burning bush, tells him he is the chosen one, he's the representative and so forth. He's going to be the lawgiver of the people and so forth. And he comes down from the mountain. Of course, eventually when he goes back up on the mountain later and he comes down with the 10 commandments and so forth, the divine law. Tehuti is the deity that scribes literally the divine law on the masculine side. Seshat, the female goddess of wisdom, she scribes the divine law on the feminine side. Of course, the crackers are dissexual, homosexual, disordered, and so forth. They always suppress the female. So you never heard about a female divinity of divine wisdom, except for where they mention Sophia very quickly in the Bible, talking about she was the one of wisdom. But Sophia is a corruption of a title of Seshat, the deity of divine wisdom. Her name is Sofik Abut. And Sofik Abu became Sophie Abu, or Sophia. That's a corruption of her title. So when you see Sophia as wisdom in the Bible and so forth, that's a corruption of Seshat. But of course, it's not developed. So, Moshe and Anan. Now, this cosmology was known by our people in Kamit for thousands of years. Had nothing to do with an individual leaving Kamit and going into the Near East and taking over 1 million people out of the country to follow him into a desert or wilderness and wander for 40 years to get to the promised land. That's never been the case. The entire cosmology comes from this particular text, and the oldest rendering of the text was during the time of Tutankhamen, before Ramesu or Ramses was born, before the treasury cities of Pithom and Rameses that they said the Israelites were working on, before that even existed. And of course, there were no Israelites in Kamit, period. But when they looked at the chronology of ancient Kamit and all the different kings going back thousands of years all the way to the present day and so forth, they have a whole list of the trustorical chronology of the country. The different kings, queens, how long they reigned, what they did and so forth, their interactions with different countries in the Near East. They have that whole chronology laid out on one side of the paper. On the other blank side of the paper, they see a little area between this time period and this time period, and the crackers will say, that's where we were. We're going to stick ourselves there and say we were living there at that time. Then we're going to say we migrated into Palestine and so forth, and put it within that time frame. And then we're going to name different cities around that time frame and things that were going on. And those things are true and historical, trustorical. But us inserting ourselves in that time period is insane. Once again, you can pretend like you can talk about how the COVID virus came out of the labs in Wuhan, China, and so forth, and people who were working on those labs and Dr. Fauci's people were investing in those labs and so forth. You can write that entire story, and then you can stick yourself in the lab and say, oh, I was actually working in that lab for about 5 years. I was on a, internship. You're lying. When people look at the story of Wuhan and the labs and everything else, they'll see all of that is true. And if they're ignorant, they'll assume that because all of that was true, your little story about how you lived there for 5 years and worked in the lab, they'll assume that was true as well, because all of the other facts that you gave them that surrounded that is true. This is what's happening. So instead of the truth of Moshe and Aaron, these are different deities. And it's about when you transition or cross over, Pear, Pear, cross over from the physical world to the spirit realm. If you follow Tehuti in the physical world, lived in harmony with divine order, then when you go to the spirit realm, he will adjudicate you Ma'ah share. That's his role. He must do that. And then when you adjudicate it as Ma'ah share, and you're proclaimed to be proven to be that, then you can cross over into the ancestral realm, the pristine environment, and now you can live amongst your spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors for the next 100 or 200 years until it's time for you to reincarnate through one of your descendants and come back into the world. That is the cosmology of Moshe and Aaron, and the quote unquote burning bush and so forth. We're also going to get into, and we'll talk about this in coming up, but just give you a little snapshot. So now understanding that cosmology, which is very important, we touched on this a little bit. So that's cosmology, but they wanted to make these deities people, or at least wanted to make a couple of them people, Moshe and Aaron, to make them males, Moses and Aaron and so forth, create the false idea that the promised land wasn't the spirit realm. The promised land was Palestine, because crackers wanted to invade and take over Palestine and claim it for themselves. But they had to say a deity told them to come claim it. And when did that deity tell you that? And who was that deity? And how did it happen? They took this entire story, even the names of the deities, took the names of the deities, gave it to a fictional character and said it was Moshe and Aaron. And the God told him that when he was up on the mountain, and God was in the form of divine light. And he came down and he became the lawgiver, and he's the one of wisdom and so forth, and he's the mouthpiece of the deity and so forth. And we need to follow him. And if we follow him, we'll get to the promised land. Every Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit individual, if we follow Tehuti, Ma'al, shared, we will get to the Sekhet Hetep, the divine field of peace and paradise and so forth. If we live in harmony with divine law, as laid out by the scribe of divine law, the lawgiver, then we will get to the promised land. Even in your everyday life, if you live in harmony with divine law, you will operate and be in connection with other individuals and your ancestresses and ancestors guiding you. You'll be in a harmonious state of functioning. You'll be in the quote unquote promised land or living a harmonious lifestyle. If you go against divine order, then you fall into all kinds of disorder, creating disorder for yourself and those who are connected to you. So if you follow Tehuti in life, that means you're following divine order in life and you get to a good place every day in life. If you go against Tehuti, you're going against divine order, then you fall into problems. But they wanted to take spiritual functions, divinities, carnalize them into something physical, make them crackers in the Near East and so forth, and say that we were led into the promised land. Now, part of that process is to pick a period in true story. They picked that particular period and said that, you know, they were in Egypt and they were led out and they were living amongst, you know, in Palestine. Archaeologists, we're going to get into this next week, they show that when they talk about 600,000 men and so forth, plus their women and children, that's over 1 million people, they said, got up and left Kamit and went into the wilderness. We were the most meticulous recorders of true story, history, and so forth. There's no record anywhere of 1 million people just walking out of the country. That would have destroyed the entire economy and sent shockwaves throughout the entire region. Of course, it never happened. Now, but they had to place themselves in a specific period of history. They picked that period, the Pithom and Rameses, Pear and Rameses section of true story. And then they said they were in the Middle East, the Near East. Europeans had already invaded the Near East. They wanted to maintain control of the Near East, the so-called region of Canaan, so-called Canaan. So they wanted to pretend like that was the land that was given to them, and that's why they're there, and that's why they need to stay in control. And they're still promoting that foolish idea now. Jews, so-called Jews in Israel, saying we needed to move to Israel because God promised us that land, and there are wars going on because, you know, some crackers said that God gave them the land. It's insane. But that's what they've been doing for a few thousand years. Now, in order to try to make themselves seem historical, because all archaeologists across the board know that there were no ancient Hebrews, there's no evidence of any of them or any of these kings or any of these personages and so forth. It never happened. No records of anybody anywhere around all these nations that had records of history and so forth, and all of these areas. Nobody mentions any Hebrew kingdom, any Hebrew people, and none of this stuff happened. So they have to stick themselves in the period and try to identify themselves with people who are operating at the time. So now there's a group called the Aperu, and we just talked about that a little bit, but they were all over the Near East for over 1,000+ years. So first, when they picked that group of people and said, well, that was, you know, that was us, it really didn't fit into their narrative because they tried to pretend like the Aperu were descendants of Abraham and so forth, and they existed within a certain period. But when people started doing the records search and so forth and studying, the archaeologists were studying and digging up different things, they found Aperu or Aperu people all over the Near East. Akkad, ancient Sumer, Akkad, Canaan and so forth, other Syria, other parts of the Near East, they're all over the place in different areas. There weren't some little group of people who went into the region of Palestine and took over and so forth. So they couldn't say they were the Aperu because that goes before their little fake history came into being. It didn't fit their chronology. So they started saying, well, a part of us were the Aperu and so forth. And this is why they use the term Hebrew, because they got it from Aperu, which actually comes from Aperu. And as we're going to start showing next week, what does the cosmological understanding of Aperu or Aperu mean? And it goes right back to what we're talking about. Crossing over from the physical realm to the spirit realm when you're engaged in the after-death state, as well as the spiritual state, when you go into the spirit realm for spirit possession, spirit communication, divination, and so forth, and you cross the boundary of the physical into the spiritual, Pear, Peru, and you cross the boundary and so forth. Now you're in the spirit realm and so forth to communicate with the ancestral spirits, deities, to receive what you need to receive. So, but let's, there's one other piece I want to show you real quick, and then we'll take some questions. We're going to get into this next week, but you talk about the land of Canaan, and they were promised the land of Canaan, and they brought their religion to the land of Canaan and so forth. And Yahweh, we just showed Yah is the title of the moon divinity, and Yahu or Yahweh and so forth is where Yahweh comes from. That's a corruption of the title of the moon in ancient Kamit that goes back thousands of years before this whole Hebrew myth was manufactured. They'll say the only historical reference for the word Israel outside of the biblical text is on the Mer Impetas Stele in ancient Kamit. And they'll say this little section mentions Israel, and they will say, well, see, that's proof that Israel was real, because even in ancient Egypt, the word Israel exists and it represents the people. Actually, it doesn't say Israel. We did a whole article on this. But what's important, however, that we just want to point out real quick, when you see the deities of ancient Kamit, popular deities and so forth, like Alsar and Atem and Ra and so forth, once again, you have Tehuti. Yah, the moon divinity, the moon god and so forth. In the Coptic dialect, the late period dialect that came into existence at the end of the Kameti dynasties about 2,000 years ago, the way they pronounce Yah was I-O-H, Yah, Yah, also Y-O-O-H, Yo, Y-O-I-O-I-H, Yoe, Yoe, Yahweh, and so forth. This is where you get Yahweh, corrupted into Yahweh by the Europeans. But so you're familiar, for example, with the deity Alsar wearing the great crown. The Hetch crown is what it's called. Typically this crown right here, and then when it has the two feathers on the Hetch crown, it's called the Atef crown. This is just a golden statue of Alsar. You'll see these, you know, of course, for thousands of years, from pre-dynastic times all the way to, you know, for thousands of years and so forth. This is one of the golden statues of Alsar. Here's another statue with the same crown, the Atef crown with the, you know, feathers and so forth. Only difference is that's the deity from ancient Canaan, or Kanana. That's the god El from Canaan. Why does the god El from Canaan have the same kind of iconography of the deities from ancient Kemet? Because the people of Kemet, as well as the people of Kanat, Nubia, they're the ones who migrated north, settled the regions of Kanana, which was later called Canaan and so forth, settled the region which was later called Sumer, and later Babylon, and now it's called Iraq. But we were the people, we migrated to those regions and carried the exact same religion from ancient Khani and Kemet, Nubia and Egypt, into the Near East and continue to practice. The deity El, when they talk about El Adonai and El Shaddai and El Elyon and all this other stuff, that's a corruption of the Canaanite or Kanana deity El. And El, when he's called El Gabal, or El of the mountain, the great divinity of the mountain and so forth, El is a Kanana dialectical variant of U and Ur in ancient Kemet. That's actually a title of Ra. So in Kanana, Ra is called El and has different titles and so forth, or Ul. And we're going to get into that next week. But that Canaanite or Kanana pantheon of divinities, this is where they took the name El and they began to conflate El and Yah, and El and Yahweh, and try to say that's the same divinity and so forth. Originally, El is Ra, and Yah is the moon divinity, the sun. Ra operates through the sun. He's not the sun divinity, but he'll utilize the sun to transmit his energy. So you have El, who operates through the sun, and Yah, who operates through the moon. Ra and Tehuti, and they tried to conflate it and say Yah and El is the same divinity, and El is just a title of Yahweh and all this other nonsense. So we're going to get into that next week. But the most important part is that the entire cosmology of Moshe and Anan, Moshe and Anan, or Moshe and Aran, or Moses and Aaron and so forth, there's a specific divinity that leads the people to the promised land. So we have the text that shows the creator making the promised land, why he made the promised land in the first place, after destroying the disordered men and women, decided to make the promised land, why he made Tehuti the representative, why he uses Tehuti to ward off those spirits of the individuals he loathes and so forth, because Tehuti is the Ocheyame or Chime, the spokesperson that wards off the evil and so forth. The entire cosmology is ours. Has nothing to do with whites or Black people migrating into Palestine. Pure foolishness. Now, there's one other piece that we want to touch on. If you have any questions, post them in the chat room and we'll answer questions. Because we're really done, I just want to show one more thing. Because this is also an important piece in our book, The Origin of the Term Yoga, Kara Kasa, the origin and nature of the chakra. We show etymologically and cosmologically these terms, yoga and chakra, yoga and kakra comes from, yoga comes from yuk and Proto-Indo-European yunk, and that's ankh, which is the yoke and so forth. The term yoke, to yoke or to unite, join and unite, that's yunk in Proto-Indo-European language family. And that's because in ancient Kamit, the ankh is literally a yoke that's tied around the animal that represents the animating force. And the ankh is a yonk or yoke and so forth. This is where you get the term yonk or yoke from. It's a talisman that unites the spirit and the soul in the body and so forth. So we go into detail about that, but then we also show the etymology of the term chakra, which is written kakra, which means a wheel or a circle and so forth. That is stolen from kara, kara, anything round, staff, stick, roll, or cylinder in ancient Kamit. It's also the term for the shrine, the kara shrine and kara kara shrine and so forth, the shrines of energy in the body. The reason why that's important, and we show these things predate Hinduism by thousands of years. The Kasu 7, when you look at ancient Kamit, this is not Thes, but Kes or Kesu or Kasu. The knot, the ligature, the backbone, the vertebrae. That's what it says in the hieroglyphic dictionary. Kasu 7, the 7 magical knots, ligaments, vertebrae that protected a man. So if you look at the term Kas and its ligature, backbone, or vertebrae, or spine, then you have 7 knots by the vertebrae, by the spine, and so forth. And those Kasu 7, the 7 magical knots that protected a man, that's associated with the spine, the vertebrae, the backbone. And you also have the Kasu 7, the 7 gods who assisted at the judgment and condemnation of the wicked. There are 7 deities that govern the 7 knots that are up and down the spine and so forth. And the reason why that's important, of course, is because when you look at the 7 karu, misnomer chakras or chakras, but karu in ancient Kamit, they're connected to these 7 masses or knots of nerve endings. These nerve endings or network or knot of spinal nerves, there are 7 knots of nerves, 7 plexuses or plexi. They're the nerve ganglia or nerve endings in the form of a bunch of nerve endings or a knot, and there are 7 knots. Those are the 7 knots along the spine. In ancient Kamit, they said there's 7 magical knots along the spine and 7 deities that govern the 7 magical knots along the spine. Those are the physical shrines, those 7 knots of the karu, so-called chakras, and those deities that govern that. But there's one up here near the third eye region. Of course, the third eye region becomes illuminate. So that knot of nerves in the third eye region that becomes illuminate and so forth, when you become illuminate, you can see wisdom, see in the darkness, you can see spirits walking around and so forth. You're clairvoyant, you can see in the darkness, see what's unseen. When you go up here in this cavern or this cave in this peak of the mountain, and then you go where this bunch of nerves, this nerve ganglia are, and you send the energy up the spine and it illuminates this bunch of nerves, so this knot of nerve endings, this plexus, this nerve ganglia, that's the bush. The illumination or the energy is burning the bush, and that's where the enlightenment comes from. So when they say he went up on the mountain, saw the God in the form of divine light or burning bush, internally for Tehuti is at the third eye center where the pineal gland is and where this bunch of knots, this bunch of nerve ganglia, nerve endings are. That's the bush. When it becomes enlightened or fired up with the energy of Ra and Ra, it becomes a burning bush, and that's where the illumination and the capacity to speak directly with the divinity takes place. So there's a quote unquote metaphysical or cosmological reason for that internally, as well as with regard to the people themselves collectively, externally, as far as the cosmologies we talked about. So no matter what way you talk about it, whether it's an internal unfolding that has to do with specific deities, each one of these different 7 nerve ganglia, these plexi, these collections of knots and so forth in the body are governed by specific divinities. When we engage in the ritual, process and so forth, we invoke these different divinities. We've always known this. This has nothing to do with Hinduism. We've been doing this for thousands of years, before Hinduism existed. And all the different traditions, and we show this in our Khan as well, all the different traditions on the continent have names for this, and it's different than the way it's expressed by white Hindus and so forth, and Buddhists and others. Now, because we're the originators. So, but whether you're talking about internally connecting with the divinities in each one of these centers, not just the third eye center, but each one of the centers, not just going up to the mountain to see the form of the divinity burning your little nerve bush so you can see and communicate with divinity. You can communicate with divinities in all of these different quote unquote bushes, not just the third eye bush up in the mountains. So, all right. Yes, Tehuti holds the staff with the snakes, just as they say Moses' staff turns into snakes, and they'll say the snakes swallow the other staff and so forth. And we just showed an image of that, if you recall, just looking back. When we look at if you look closely, the 2 staffs that he's holding are encircled by 2 snakes in the form of the female divinities Wachet and Nekabet. and they're swallowing both of those staffs. So the snakes are encircling or swallowing both staffs. That is Moshe. Hold on a second. That's Moshe, raising up serpents in the wilderness. And of course, that staff is, serpents climbing the staff and everything else. There's the, ascent up the back and the descent down the front. You have the serpents, actually Ra and Ra'ed and so forth. And when we get into some of that, in the coming weeks, we'll show that that goes back to the pyramid texts are the oldest religious compositions unearthed in the world. When you look at the pyramid texts, it says Unas, the Pear Unas, is the Na snake, the leading bull who has swallowed his 7 aratu, the 7 cobras, the 7 snakes. And so his 7 neck vertebrae came into being, who gives orders to his 7 pasjetu to hear the words of the king. So they're talking about, that's in the pyramid text of Unas and so forth. They're talking about him in the form of a snake swallowing 7 snakes, and those 7 snakes that he swallowed became radiant forces that became his 7 neck vertebrae. This is the pyramid text. Thousands of years before Hinduism, we're already talking about, 7 serpent powers becoming the cervical or the neck vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae and so forth, and the 7 knots along the spine, fully incorporated in ritual, thousands of years before Indo-Aryans and so forth. So that's the foundation, that's the cosmology, the foundation, the basis as far as the etymology. We're going to get in much more detail about Aperu and why the cosmology of the crossing over is why it's so important. But first and foremost, of course, they don't find any evidence of any quote unquote Hebrews because they didn't exist. They stole the entire story of the promised land, promised to a group of people who will follow God's representative on earth, whose name was Moshe, and who had an assistant called Aaron or Aaron and so forth. That entire story is talking about Black people, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. When we follow the deity of divine wisdom, then we will be led to the promised land, the ancestral realm after death, and also through ritual during life. So when you pour libation, engage in ritual song, ritual dance, meditation, and so forth, and you go and cross over into the spirit realm, if you live in harmony with Tehuti as well as Seshat, the male and female deities of divine wisdom, then you will be opened up to go to the promised land, the divine land and so forth, to get what you need from the promised land, that divine wisdom, so you can download that into yourself. So when you come out of meditation, come out of possession, come out of ritual, you're fortified with that divine wisdom, and then you can apply that to different aspects of your life to, correct, things that were imbalanced or disordered and so forth. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and end it here if we don't have any more questions. We have a lot more cosmology, especially dealing with the pyramid text that most people don't talk about at all, but it's directly related to the subject. We're going to get into that next week. All right. And for those of you who, we mentioned this, we are going back to Kamit in May. So this is our Archaeological tour, Cosmology of Creation, tour to Kamit and Kamit, Egypt and Nubia. We put 13 little video clips out from our recent trip just to show the 12 different cities that we went to and the different things that we were doing and so forth, tombs and temples and shrines and so forth. So you can see some of that on the piece, but you can, we do have some spots available. You can make a deposit to secure your space. Of course, we have payment plans available, so you can make monthly payments from now all the way through the beginning of May. And then there are also options within PayPal of pay later. where you can, stretch out your payments for 24 months or 12 months or whatever. There are different options that way as well. So if you would like to attend, go on that trip with us, May 23rd through the 31st. We still have some spots available. Of course, it's open. If you let people know about it, it's open to Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African Black people only. So. Okay, so Yedase, we thank everybody for tuning in. We will be posting this up. We'll let you know when it's posted and so forth. We'll probably more than likely put a clip or something on YouTube, but we'll post this up so you'll have access to it so you can go back and, rewatch it as well as download those books. All of our books are free downloads. You can download those books. Some of our other courses. Let me just show one more thing. So when you go to the page, so to get the books, it is the Nhoma page on our website. So the books that we pulled up today, you can download them for free. It's the Nhoma page on our website. So when you go to that page, you will see the covers, KUKUU-TUNTUM. It's all of our 31 books. You can download all of them. We just showed the Ra and Raed book, the Ankh origin of the term yoga, origin of the term chakra book, and so forth. But all of them, you'll see that there, so you can download them for free as you're reviewing. And then we also have our KUKUU-TUNTUM page, which you went to, of course, to sign up for this class. But we have 34 other courses that are all archived, as you can see. So you can download those courses. You can access them and study as well and get some deeper information on this information, deeper insight on this information. Okay, so Yedase, we thank everybody for tuning in, and Yebeshiabio, we will meet again. That's it.